After a lifetime dedicated to a feud, a lone mountain man becomes the unwilling guardian of his slain enemy's only brother. This single act of forced mercy turns to poison, bringing paranoia and war directly to his doorstep, because the moment he believed his personal war was finally over, he had unknowingly welcomed a serpent into his home. This is how a world built on vengeance collapses. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. I hope you're all doing well, and I'd love to hear where you're listening from today. Jonah stood over the body of Silas, the still air heavy with the metallic scent of cooling blood and spent gunpowder. The long war, a bitter feud that had consumed years and stained the soil with the lives of men from both clans, had apparently reached its conclusion with the weight of his own hand. He looked down at the man who had been the focal point of his existence for a decade, the architect of his deepest hatreds, and felt a profound emptiness cascade through him. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfaction of vengeance fulfilled, only the deafening silence that follows a storm and the deep aching weariness that settles into the bones. All around them, the scorched earth bore the scars of their final, brutal confrontation, and the impassive mountains stood as silent witnesses to the end of this violent chapter. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the battlefield, making the dead seem to writhe in the fading light. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, like a beautiful apple rotten to the core, its taste turning to ash in his mouth. He nudged Silas's rifle with the toe of his worn boot, the metal scraping against the rocky ground with a grating sound that echoed the discord inside him. For as long as he could remember, his life had been defined by this conflict, his days measured in patrols and his nights in sleepless vigilance. Every decision, every alliance, and every loss had been a move in this deadly game against Silas. Now, with the game board overturned and the king fallen, Jonah found himself without a purpose, a warrior with no war left to fight. He slowly raised his gaze to the vast and different expanse of the sky, where the first stars were beginning to emerge. The fight had cost him everything, his youth, his peace, and the men who had fallen beside him. He had paid that price willingly, believing the end would justify the means, but the quiet that now surrounded him offered no justification, only a stark and unsettling void. He had spent his life chasing a monster, and now that the monster was slain, he was left alone with the silence and the chilling realization that the chase had become a part of him he might never be able to excise. A faint scraping sound from a dilapidated barn nearby pulled Jonah from his grim reverie, a noise almost lost beneath the whisper of the wind. With his rifle held loosely at his side, he moved toward the source, his boots crunching on the gravel and debris littering the ground. The barn door hung precariously on a single hinge, groaning in protest as he pushed it open. Inside, the darkness was thick, broken only by thin slivers of twilight piercing through the warped wooden slats. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he saw a figure huddled in the far corner, a man so still he might have been mistaken for a sack of grain. It was Samuel, Silas's younger brother, a person known more for his books and quiet demeanor than for any skill with a weapon. He was the antithesis of his formidable sibling, a detail that made his survival both pathetic and complicated. Fear radiated from him in palpable waves, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the man who had just killed his only living relative. Jonah felt a surge of cold instinct, the ingrained impulse to eliminate any remaining threat, to sever the bloodline of his enemy completely and irrevocably. Yet, as he raised his rifle, the unwritten law of the mountains, a code older and more binding than any personal vendetta, stayed his hand. This was not a warrior before him. This was a man defeated by a world he was never built for, and the code was clear. You do not leave an unarmed man for the buzzards or the wolves. A wave of disgust directed as much at himself as at the situation washed over Jonah. He lowered the rifle and jerked his head toward the entrance. "Get up," he commanded, his voice a low growl, devoid of any warmth or pity. "You're coming with me." Samuel flinched at the sound, but slowly, unsteadily, rose to his feet. Every hesitant step he took out of that barn and into the twilight felt like a betrayal of Jonah's victory, a living, breathing consequence that he was now, against all desire, responsible for. The enemy, in a form he could neither fight nor kill, was now walking behind him, his shadow merging with Jonah's in the dying light. The days that followed were suffocating, each one a testament to the oppressive power of unspoken words. Life within the confines of Jonah's small, isolated cabin became an exercise in shared misery, the space thick with a tension that was almost physical. Samuel existed as a phantom of the war, a ghost at the table whose very presence was a constant searing reminder of the man Jonah had killed. He moved silently, took up little space, and ate what was given to him without a word, his eyes perpetually downcast, fixed on the floorboards, as if the patterns in the wood held some answer to his fate. For Jonah, every quiet meal was a torment. Every accidental brush of shoulders in the narrow hallway, a jolt of unwelcome contact with his enemy's blood. He found himself spending more time outdoors, chopping wood with a furious energy that did little to quell the storm raging inside him, the simple physical act a poor substitute for the release he craved. The silence was a language of its own, speaking of guilt, hatred, and a future neither of them had chosen. This fragile, hostile truce was shattered when 3 of Jonah's men rode up to the cabin, their arrival announced by the crunch of hooves on dry earth. Among them was Marcus, Jonah's second-in-command, a man whose loyalty and battlefield prowess had been unquestionable for years. Their faces, already grim from the recent conflict, hardened further when they saw Samuel emerge from the cabin behind Jonah. Marcus's eyes, cold and sharp as flint, fixed on the younger brother of their sworn enemy. He dismounted, his movements stiff with disapproval. "Jonah, what is the meaning of this?" Marcus asked, his voice low, but carrying an edge of steel. He didn't wait for an answer, his gaze sweeping over Samuel with undisguised contempt. "The men won't understand this. Harboring the brother of the man who killed our own. It's an insult to their memory. That man has no place here among us." The other 2 men stood silently behind him, their expressions mirroring his sentiment, their collective judgment hanging heavy in the air. The unspoken tension within the cabin had now spilled outside, transforming into open hostility and planting the first seeds of dissent in the ground Jonah thought he had secured. The combined weight of the preceding weeks, the violent climax of the feud, the death of his brother, and the constant simmering threat of living with his captor, finally broke Samuel's fragile constitution. He succumbed to a violent fever that left him shivering uncontrollably one moment and burning with an internal fire the next. Jonah, bound by the same reluctant duty that had made him spare the man's life, found himself in the unwelcome role of caretaker. He forced broth and water between Samuel's chapped lips, his actions mechanical and devoid of compassion, yet performed with a grim diligence. The nights were the worst, filled with the soft, incoherent murmurs of a mind adrift in a sea of sickness and memory. Jonah would sit by the fire, cleaning his rifle for the 10th time, trying to block out the unsettling sounds coming from the cot in the corner of the room. It was on the 3rd night of the fever that the mumbled phrases began to coalesce into something more tangible, something that cut through Jonah's weary indifference. Samuel, tossing in a state of delirium suspended between the living world and the next, began to speak in fragmented but urgent whispers. Jonah caught isolated words at first, silver, then betrayal, and then a phrase that made him pause his work, his hands freezing on the stock of his rifle. A deal for the creek," Samuel muttered, his voice raspy and thin. Jonah moved closer, straining to hear over the crackling of the fire. He dismissed it as the nonsensical rambling of a dying man, until one word, one name, was uttered with a chilling clarity that seemed to sober the very air in the cabin. "Marcus," Samuel breathed, the name a clear, sharp note in the symphony of his fevered monologue. Marcus promised him. The name hung in the silence, an accusation from a world of delirium, yet it landed in Jonah's mind with the solid weight of a stone, disturbing the placid surface of his trust and sending ripples of suspicion outward into the darkness. By morning, the fever had broken, leaving Samuel weak and drenched in sweat, but lucid for the first time in days. The delirium was gone, But the words he had spoken during the night remained, having taken root in the fertile ground of Jonah's unease. They poisoned his thoughts, replaying in his mind with relentless persistence. He started connecting disparate, previously insignificant memories. Marcus's sudden acquisition of a new horse and saddle. A small fortune he had claimed came from a lucky card game. His unusual insistence that the final assault on Silas's camp was not just necessary, but urgent, pushing the attack forward by 2 days. At the time, Jonah had seen it as tactical boldness, but now, filtered through the lens of Samuel's fevered whispers, it appeared sinister. The pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed began to click into place, forming a picture of profound betrayal he wasn't ready to accept. He strode over to Samuel's cot, his movements sharp and devoid of any gentleness. Grabbing the front of Samuel's damp shirt, Jonah hauled him into a sitting position, ignoring the man's weak protest. "You were talking in your sleep," Jonah said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You mentioned a deal. You mentioned the creek, and you mentioned Marcus." Samuel's eyes widened with a fresh wave of terror, his newfound lucidity a curse. "Tell me everything, right now." Under the intensity of Jonah's gaze, the truth spilled out of him in a torrent of fearful, broken sentences. He confessed that Marcus had secretly met with Silas weeks before the final battle. The offer was simple and treacherous. Marcus would provide tactical information, ensuring Jonah's forces were led into a vulnerable position, making the final confrontation swift and decisive. In exchange for betraying Jonah and ensuring Silas's victory, Marcus was promised the deed to a silver-rich creek that ran through Jonah's land. The final attack, Samuel revealed, wasn't just a battle. It was a carefully orchestrated assassination plot, one that had simply gone wrong when Jonah, against the odds, had emerged the victor. A cold, calculated fury settled over Jonah, replacing the hot anger of his initial discovery. He knew that a direct accusation against a man like Marcus, respected and feared by their men, would be met with denial and could easily fracture the clan into warring factions. He needed more than the word of his enemy's brother. He needed to see the lie for himself. He left Samuel in the cabin with a stern warning to remain silent and rode out toward the main camp where his men were based, the landscape blurring past him as his mind raced. He was no longer their undisputed leader returning to his warriors. He was an infiltrator, a spy in his own territory, hunting for the subtle cracks in a foundation of loyalty he had always believed to be solid rock. The familiar faces that greeted him upon his arrival now seemed like masks, their smiles and nods of respect potentially concealing ignorance or, worse, complicity. He found Marcus near the corral, overseeing the distribution of supplies. Jonah approached him with a calm he did not feel, leaning against the fence as if he were just there for a casual conversation. "I've been thinking about that last push against Silas," Jonah began, his tone deliberately conversational, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "It was a damn risky move, cornering them like that. We were lucky more men weren't lost." He paused, then turned his gaze directly to Marcus. "You were always certain it would work. What made you so sure?" He watched Marcus's face intently, searching for any flicker of unease, any sign of a lie being constructed. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation, a confident smirk playing on his lips. "I studied their patterns for months, Jonah. I knew Silas's pride would make him overconfident and lead him right into our hands." The answer was smooth, logical, and perfectly rehearsed. It was too perfect. There was no hint of the doubt that precedes a gamble, no acknowledgement of the chaos of battle. In that moment, watching the easy confidence of the man he had trusted with his life, Jonah knew with absolute certainty that he was being lied to. The confirmation of Marcus's treachery left Jonah feeling profoundly isolated, a man adrift on a sea of deceit. He needed an anchor, someone whose loyalty was beyond question, a voice of reason to echo in the chamber of his own dark thoughts. There was only one person he could turn to, Elias, a grizzled fighter who had ridden with Jonah's father and had known Jonah since he was a boy. He found Elias mending a leather strap by the fading light of a campfire, his weathered face a map of countless battles and hard seasons. Jonah sat down beside him, the silence stretching between them for a long moment before he finally spoke. his voice low and heavy with the weight of his words. He laid out the entire story from Samuel's fevered whispers to the chillingly composed lies that had just fallen from Marcus's lips. Elias listened without interruption, his hands stilling their work as the terrible narrative unfolded. When Jonah finished, the old warrior slowly shook his head, his expression a mixture of shock and profound disbelief. "Marcus," he said, the name sounding foreign and wrong on his tongue. "Jonah, that can't be right. I've known that man for 10 years. We've bled together on a dozen different battlefields. He pulled me from a rock slide that would have crushed me." Elias's loyalty to his comrades was a deeply ingrained part of his character, and the idea of such a fundamental betrayal was something his mind struggled to process. The conversation was strained and difficult, with Elias trying to find alternative explanations while Jonah held firm to the ugly truth he had uncovered. He left Elias by the fire, the old man staring into the flames with a troubled expression, and Jonah felt a new kind of loneliness. The truth had not brought him an ally. It had only served to isolate him further, leaving him to carry the terrible burden of this knowledge completely on his own. Jonah realized that words and suspicions were not enough to break the hold Marcus had on the men. He needed to force the serpent out of its hiding place and make it strike in the open for all to see. A plan began to form in his mind, a dangerous gambit that hinged on Marcus's greed and his desperate need to keep his treachery buried. The next day he gathered a small group of his senior men, including both Marcus and Elias, and made a formal announcement. He presented his plan with a facade of strategic wisdom, his voice steady and confident. "The fighting is over, but the hatred remains," he declared to the assembled men. "To ensure a lasting peace and prevent the sons of Silas's clan from seeking revenge, we need to make a gesture of goodwill." He then looked directly at Marcus, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to take Samuel and ride to what remains of his family's encampment. I will return him as a sign that our war is with the warriors who fought us, not with their entire bloodline. His presence will be the guarantee of a new peace." Jonah watched as a flicker of barely concealed panic crossed Marcus's face before it was quickly suppressed and replaced with a mask of thoughtful agreement. Jonah knew he had set the hook perfectly. Marcus could not allow Samuel to reach his own people. The young man was a living witness who could expose the entire conspiracy. By creating a situation where Samuel was being moved and could potentially speak to others, Jonah was forcing Marcus's hand. The traitor would have no choice but to act decisively to silence the one person who could bring his world crashing down around him. The trap was set, baited with the very secret Marcus was so desperate to protect. The plan was immediately set into motion just as Jonah had anticipated. He and Samuel rode out the next morning, taking a winding path through a narrow rock-strewn canyon, a location that offered both seclusion and numerous opportunities for an ambush. The air was tense, the only sounds the rhythmic clatter of their horses' hooves on the stone and the whistle of the wind through the high rock walls. From a high ridge overlooking the canyon, Elias watched, his heart heavy with a conflict he desperately wished was not real. Jonah had secretly visited him the night before, asking him not to believe, but simply to watch and see the truth for himself. Now, hidden among the boulders, he waited, a silent observer to a potential tragedy. The attack came with a sudden, violent eruption of gunfire that echoed off the canyon walls. Marcus and 3 other men, fighters whose loyalty to him surpassed their loyalty to the clan, appeared on the trail ahead, their rifles raised. This was not the honorable combat of a clan war. It was a desperate and dirty assassination attempt, a frantic effort to eliminate witnesses and bury a secret. The ambushers had expected to face only Jonah and his unarmed captive, but they had underestimated Jonah's readiness. As the first shots rang out, Jonah reacted instantly, shoving Samuel from his horse and behind a large boulder before returning fire. High above, Elias saw it all with horrifying clarity. He saw Marcus, the man he had called brother, firing on their leader. The agonizing doubt that had plagued him was burned away in an instant, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of betrayal. He raised his own rifle, the choice no longer a choice at all, and his first shot took one of the ambushers down, turning the tide of the desperate fight below. The skirmish was a chaotic whirlwind of close-quarters gunfire and brutal, desperate action. It was short, vicious, and utterly devoid of the grim honor that had characterized their previous battles. With Elias providing covering fire from above, Jonah was able to maneuver through the rocks, his movements fluid and deadly. One by one, the other ambushers fell, leaving only Marcus, who now faced Jonah alone amidst the smoke and the ringing silence that followed the gunfire. With a savage cry, Marcus charged, choosing to fight with a knife rather than reload. The ensuing struggle was personal and raw, a clash not of soldiers, but of two men fueled by years of shared history now twisted into pure hatred. Jonah, stronger and driven by the cold fury of betrayal, managed to disarm Marcus, a well-placed blow sending the knife skittering across the rocks. Jonah slammed Marcus back against the sheer rock face of the canyon, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He pressed the barrel of his rifle hard under Marcus's chin, forcing his head back. At that moment, Elias scrambled down from his perch, his face a mask of shock and disgust as he approached the scene. "Tell him," Jonah snarled, his voice low and trembling with rage, his eyes locked on Marcus's. "Tell him why you did it." Cornered, defeated, and staring down the barrel of a gun, the facade of Marcus's composure finally shattered completely. A sneer twisted his lips as he looked past Jonah to Elias. He was weak, Marcus spat, his voice filled with venomous resentment. He let sentiment and honor get in the way of real power. That Silver Creek was worth more than his entire pathetic clan. "I would have made us strong." The confession, raw and filled with years of festering greed and jealousy, hung in the air, an ugly testament to the truth that had cost them all so much. The journey back to the main camp was a long, silent procession of grim reality. Marcus was bound and thrown over his own horse, a prisoner of the very man he had sought to usurp. Elias rode alongside Jonah, his face etched with a deep sorrow, the confirmation of the betrayal having aged him a decade in a single afternoon. When they arrived, the men gathered, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern at the sight of Marcus tied and bleeding. There, in the center of the camp, with his former second-in-command as a symbol of the rot within, Jonah told them the whole story. He spoke not with anger, but with a flat, weary tone that lent his words an undeniable gravity. Elias stood beside him, his presence a silent, irrefutable corroboration of the terrible truth. A wave of stunned silence washed over the camp as the full scope of the deception was revealed. The men looked from Jonah to the bound figure of Marcus, and then at each other, their expressions shifting from disbelief to a slow, dawning anger, which was quickly followed by a bitter sense of disillusionment. The war they had fought so fiercely, the friends they had lost, the sacrifices they had made, all of it had been built upon the foundation of one man's greed. The victory they had celebrated just weeks before now felt like a hollow mockery. Peace had come to them, but it was not the triumphant peace of a conqueror. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, born not from the defeat of an enemy, but from the crushing realization that their greatest battle had been waged for a complete and utter lie, and the blood they had spilled had been for nothing. Several months passed, and the harsh sun of summer began to soften into the golden light of autumn. The mountains, once the backdrop for war and betrayal, were now painted in hues of red and yellow, their beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness they had witnessed. At the edge of Jonah's property, two figures worked in tandem, their movements practiced and synchronized by weeks of shared labor. Jonah and Samuel were mending a long stretch of fence, their silence comfortable now, stripped of the hatred and fear that had once defined it. There was no friendship between them, and likely never would be. Their shared history was too fraught with blood and loss for that. But the animosity had faded, replaced by a quiet, unspoken understanding of the profound weight they both carried. They were two men from opposite sides of a meaningless war, bound together by the treachery that had ultimately ended it. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, they stopped their work. For a moment, they both stood looking out at the vast, silent landscape. The mountains, which had been stoic witnesses to their conflict, now stood guard over their fragile, hard-won peace. Jonah looked at the cabin, his home, and then at Samuel, the man he should have hated, but now simply accepted as part of his life's complicated tapestry. The emptiness he had felt after killing Silas was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier. The war was truly over. Not because an enemy was dead, but because the lie that fueled it had been exposed. He had built his world on vengeance, and he had watched it crumble. Now, on its ruins, he and the last remnant of his enemy were quietly, painstakingly building something else. A peace born not of victory, but of shared survival.